Hey, welcome back to the Motivational Intelligence Podcast, where we explore the strategies and mindsets that empower leaders to make transformational changes in their lives and in their organizations. In today's episode, I'm sitting down with Dave Naylor, a legend in the world of leadership training and motivational intelligence. Dave spent over 30 years helping leaders and teams in 97 countries around the world and more than 40% of the Fortune 500 to achieve really extraordinary results, and you'll hear about some of those today. So we're going to dive deep into how he's used motivational intelligence to transform lives, both personally and professionally, why skeptics often become the biggest believers, and the real-world impact of motivational intelligence on marriages, careers, and multi-billion-dollar organizations. So if you've ever wondered how to unlock your potential or lead your team to new heights, this conversation is going to give you the insights and the inspiration to make that happen. So please enjoy this conversation with Dave Naylor. This podcast is brought to you by 2Logical, a global top 20 training firm and the world leader in motivational intelligence development. We partner with leading executives to build the #1 talent pool in their industry. We've worked with over 40% of the Fortune 500 in 97 countries worldwide, and maybe we'll work with you next. To try our world-renowned executive coaching service for free, start a free trial of Mojo at joinmojo.com/trial. That's joinmojo.com/trial. You'll get unlimited access to the Mojo platform, custom onboarding, and 2 live coaching sessions free of charge. So, if you want to unlock even greater leadership presence and executive effectiveness, reclaim more of your time, and really build something special, get started with your free trial today at joinmojo.com/trial. That's joinmojo.com/trial.
And the more I studied it, the more I began to see that that was the overwhelming commonality of the most successful people that I ever met.
And just the empowerment of the conversations, how it just really motivates you. You don't come across people that impact you that way.
Because a lot of people could say to me, oh yeah, no, I get it. But yet they really don't get it.
This, if you really lean into it, can be life-changing. Mojo's is part of our DNA and what we do during team meetings.
And I just looked at Randy like, oh my God.
I feel like that's made a lot of impact in my direct report's life because they're not afraid to talk to me.
But I started to see what this gentleman said in the podcast. And I was like, it was just kind of surreal because it was almost like he foreshadowed what I was going to be up against that point.
They would come in every week and ask me, Paul, how far would you like to get? That's when I told them 105%. And they laughed. And I said, no, 105% is where I'm going to be.
I think that concept is one that everybody can buy into, and saying that I can improve 1% from yesterday.
An unstoppable state of mind that enables you and I to achieve everything that we want out of our professional and our personal life.
You've been in this game for a long time. What is it, 30 years you've been doing this, something like that?
Wow, I've been with 2Logical for 30, I think 33 at the end of this year. Yeah.
You obviously have a lifetime of experience, a lifetime of stories and meeting different people. You've infused motivational intelligence and what we do into people's lives, into businesses, and an absurd amount of countries all over the world. I think collectively at this point it's 97 countries, something like that. Worked and retained by 40% of the Fortune 500. Obviously played an integral part in, 2Logical has been awarded, recognized as global top 20 training firm for the last 5 years. So I kind of wanted to just have a conversation about what have you seen through the journey in terms of impact and the difference that this makes, both from a business perspective to organizations, and also kind of the individuals that you've met along the way.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you make me sound way more impressive than I feel, so thank you for that. It's been a pretty phenomenal journey, I got to say. I mean, we started out really influencing motivational intelligence before motivational intelligence really had a name, even. And so it's really, it's all about influencing people's thoughts and beliefs and in a way that helps them get out of their own way. And, really the first person that it impacted was me. As I came into 2Logical, Joe helped me, the CEO of 2Logical, really helped me to get my own thoughts and beliefs in the right place. So I experienced it firsthand very early on. and saw the difference that it made. And then as time went on, I was fortunate enough to be able to go out and help other people to do the same. But God, in the course of 32 years, I mean, we've seen people pull marriages back from divorce. We've seen, them turn around the relationships with kids, or really help struggling kids to kind of get back on the right track. We've seen people who have gone from entry-level marketing positions in organizations to be CEOs in Fortune 500 companies. So, I mean, it's pretty staggering what we've witnessed over the course of the years and the transformation it's made in people's lives. And, to feel like you played some small role in that it's certainly been the greatest professional gift that I've ever had. And I can't earnestly imagine doing anything on a professional level that would be more rewarding than that.
Yeah. Yeah, it is something to see the light bulbs go off. So let's start here, because you kind of brought it up. The first person that it impacted was you. I know what it was like for me. I met Joe, obviously, and he started kind of mentoring me around a lot of these core principles of motivational intelligence. What was that like for you?
It was interesting because I was totally unaware of any of this prior to meeting Joe. I was a business guy who working as a leader in another organization, and we actually hired him to come in and help us out with some issues and things that we were having. And so that's how he and I met. And earnestly in the beginning, I was a skeptic. I'd never seen or experienced anything like this before. And it really seemed maybe almost too good to be true. And then as time went on, more and more things kept happening, and it got harder and harder for me to refute that, hey, there's something here. So I kind of began to let down my walls and be just a little bit more open-minded in that regard, and listen more. And I still had, my own comfort zones, and you resist because of your own insecurities and self-doubts and, all of those types of things. And so it takes time. And, the more baggage you have, the more time it takes. It took a while for me. But it's, you get to a certain point and there's just this, I guess the best way that I had a client describe it to me this way one time, and it was maybe the way that made the most sense to me. When growing up, we had transistor radios when I was a kid. And so, you turn the little knob and the station would, get closer to the right number of the station. And if you were farther away you were from the station frequency, you got a lot of static. And the closer you got, the music came in more clearly. And then when you finally got it dialed in to perfect frequency, the music came in crystal clear. And in a lot of ways, that's sort of what the journey with motivational intelligence has been like for me. The more ingrained you get, the more tuned in you get. And then you get to the point where you're really tuned in, and you just see it everywhere. You hear it when people speak, whether they struggle from an MQ standpoint or whether they're tuned in themselves. And things start making a whole lot more sense. It becomes more clear to you why people are struggling, or even why you're struggling in certain situations, or areas where in the past, maybe your comfort zones would have ruled. And give you a real world case in point. You can't see it, but tucked behind the TV back here is my favorite guitar. So I started playing guitar. Well, I took lessons when I was like 15 years old for, I don't know, maybe 6 months. And it was hard, and I was struggling with it. And I just convinced myself, Dave, you're not meant to do this. And so I put the guitar in a case and slid it under my bed. And I earnestly did not think about playing the guitar again until I was in my early 40s. So I don't know, close to 30 years later, And it was interesting when I picked it up again, because I understand why things are difficult in the beginning, and I understand about how the conscious and the subconscious mind works, and I understand about how we can't compare ourselves to other people because it's not a fair comparison. And so I just approached it from a totally different mindset. Now, it was still difficult. It still takes practice and time and commitment, but I was much more willing to pay the dues as an adult because I was coming at it from a different perspective. And I think, that's part of the challenge when people struggle with their motivational intelligence or NQ is they just become masters of rationalization as to why they can't do things or why it's okay to give up on something or why it's okay to not even try. And so their whole life becomes just regulated by their fears and their self-doubts. And they really just they don't give themselves permission to try so many of the things that really bring the greatest meaning in life, whether it's asking somebody out on a date, or whether it's learning to play an instrument, or whether it's embracing a change at work, or whether it's finding a new role because you're trapped in the current one. I mean, there's just so many areas of life where people hold themselves back because of their fears and their self-doubts. And when your MQ's in the right place, it's not that you don't have experience of self-doubts, or it's not that you don't experience the fears or those kind of things. But they don't rule you the same way. You're empowered to move past those things, and life just becomes dramatically different as a result of that.
A couple things going through my head. One being not even realizing how much I was holding myself back in certain areas. I didn't even have the awareness to recognize that that's what was going on. And then you start to learn some of these things, and in hindsight, you go, oh, I get it. And then it's regardless of level of awareness, it's always easier to see it in other people than it is to see in yourself. And so that's part of the challenge of your self-awareness, but also having some people around you that, can call you on some stuff. But you mentioned in the beginning being kind of a skeptic around motivational intelligence, these principles, first meeting Joe, and then kind of got to a point where it was hard to ignore. It was hard to say that this doesn't work. What was it that got you to that point? Were there like specific things that happened, or was it an accumulation? How did you kind of get to the point from being like skeptic to, okay, I really can't ignore this anymore?
It was probably a little bit of both of those in hindsight. I watched him do things that I didn't understand. For example, I remember early on, he and I were in a conversation, and he said, in 3 months, this is going to happen. And when this happens, here's what this person will do, here's what this person will do, and here's what that person will do. And I don't know if I physically did it or if I mentally did it. I probably physically did it. I kind of rolled my eyes like, yeah, okay, whatever, and just mentally wrote it off because like you can't predict the future, And then 3 months later, what he said was going to happen happened. And those people did exactly what he said they were going to do. And I was like, okay, wait a minute. No. Had to be a fluke, right? There's no freaking way this guy can predict the future, And then I watched him do it again, and I watched him do it again. And it got to the point where I couldn't refute it. I didn't understand how or why, but I couldn't refute it anymore. So, it went right at my own skepticism in that regard. So that was one of the things that kind of got me like, okay, there's something here that I don't understand. And then, he and I would be having conversations about things, and in to your point, there would be times where we'd be talking about something and I could feel myself like kind of getting tight inside, and just resisting whatever it was he was talking about. And then, 5 hours later, I'd be laying in bed, going to sleep, and all of a sudden it was like landmines going off in my brain. And it was like, all of a sudden it was like puzzle pieces started like falling from the sky, and they're fitting together as they hit the table. And I'm like, wait a minute, what the hell, Suddenly there'd be like situations where, I was really grappling, where I was really struggling. And it was like all of a sudden crystal clear, and I'm like, whoa, what just happened here, And that happened a whole bunch of times, and then it so kind of undermined my inner skeptic. And then the whole time when I asked Joe questions, we defer to Randy, and my mentor taught me this. And I had never, I definitely had up to that point people who influenced me in different ways, never in a kind of a holistic way, but I'd had influential teachers and people would help me in business and things along those lines. But I'd never really stopped and thought about the idea of having a mentor, like a dedicated mentor. And I remember, I think we were in Rhode Island, if I remember right. And I think it was a Holiday Inn. I remember, Joe and I were having dinner, and I said, Joe, you talk a lot about your mentor. I said, would you mentor me? I said, would you teach me what he's taught you? And I'll never, I mean, literally, even as I'm telling the story, it's like mentally, I'm literally can picture the room, like I'm sitting in that room again right now, and when he just smiles at me and he goes, Randy always told me this day would come. And he said, I'd be honored to be your mentor. However, he said, before I agree, he said, I need you to make a promise to me. He goes, it's the same one that Randy asked me to make of him when I asked him to be my mentor. And I'm like, well, what's that? He said, I need you to promise me that one day you'll find your Dave Naylor and you'll teach him what I taught you. And I'm like, yeah, okay. I promise. And so I didn't realize all that meant or all would mean over the course of the next 3 decades. But that was really the beginning of it. 8 months after that, when Joe decided that he wanted to start the predecessor company to Logical, and he asked me to come help him with it. And that was kind of the beginning of the journey from there.
Yeah. Very similar kind of experience. I remember I had not really thought that much about, finding a mentor either. It was actually something my dad pushed out of college. He always said, I don't really care what you do. I just want you to find a good mentor. And I remember him introducing me to Joe at a party. And, I remember this very vividly, kind of, similar to you. But it was the first time I probably talked to him for his total 15-second interaction. My dad's like, hey, Sean, come here. I want to introduce you to Joe. Like, okay. So I walk over, he taps Joe on the shoulder. They're at my parents' house for like a soccer pizza party or something, because my brother and Morgan grew up playing soccer together. Right. And I was back in town, I think, on a holiday from college. And so he taps Joe on the shoulder, he turns around, and my dad says, hey, Joe, this is my son, Sean. He turns around, he looks at me, and he said, so I hear you want to be an entrepreneur. I said, yeah, I do. And he stuck out his hand, he looked me dead in my eyes, almost, like directly into my soul. And he goes, don't ever let anybody tell you can't. Yeah. And then he turned around and went back to his conversation. And I was kind of just standing there like, what was I don't know what that was. Like, to your point, it's really hard to put your finger on, really hard to articulate, but I was like, I don't know what that was. And then the first time we had a conversation, he blew my mind for 4 hours. He told me like, hey, if you go read this book, Think and Grow Rich, I'll get back together with you. I drove to Barnes & Noble that night, read it the next day, and called him up the next night. So I'm like, I don't know what this is, but I need some of it. But I think, to your point, an interesting part of the journey, like kind of like that mental wrestling match, like where you feel like you're resisting it. You can sense it in the moment that you're resisting it. And you're kind of going through this mental wrestling match to get to the other side. What was that experience like for you? Because I know it was like for me, just in terms of sometimes it'd be days where the mind's going.
Boy, you moved a lot quicker than I did. I think times it was years for me,
I'm sure, yeah, for me too, yeah.
But it was, it's funny Joe used an analogy with me, and I don't know if I've ever shared this story with you before. There was a movie years back called The Horse Whisperer. I had Robert Redford in it, was the main character. And he was this guy who could, get through to difficult horses, and there was this one scene in it. And so Joe told me this story one time. He said, you remember that scene in The Horse Whisperer where Robert Redford was working with his horse and kept fighting him and rearing up and pulling on its reins and doing all that? The scene started in the morning, basically. He's trying to tame this horse and it's fighting him. And finally, by like the afternoon, he realized like, okay, I'm not getting through to this horse. So he just let the reins go. He went over to the corner of the corral and just squatted down and just stayed in a squat in the corner of the corral. And then you see the sun setting and getting to be nightfall, and he's still squatting there, corner of the corral. You see the kind of time lapse, and then eventually the horse just came over to him, and he was able to make the breakthrough. And so Joe said, in a lot of ways, our relationship's kind of like that. He said, he goes, on those times where you're really fighting and you're really resisting, he goes, I know I've gotten to a pressure point for you. And he goes, I just got to give you the time and the space to work your way through it. And he goes, sometimes it happens in a day, sometimes it happens in a month, sometimes it happens in years. But the sad thing is, most people, they'll never have the opportunity to experience something like that, to be around people who have anywhere near the specialized knowledge to be able to help them to navigate their way through that. And that's part of what really drove me to want to come and be a part of Too Logical and to do all the things that we've done, like what you're doing with Mojo now. I mean, we really have now the opportunity to be that entity for all of those individuals who are never fortunate enough to have anyone around them with this specialized knowledge to really help them. And the crazy thing is, I always thought, well, there's psychologists and psychiatrists and, they kind of help people in this regard. But, the reality is nobody teaches them this. They don't learn this when they're in med school. They don't learn this when they're in university. And we've actually done, I've actually done at this point, workshops with psychologists and psychiatrists and things like that, where we teach these principles to them. And, it's crazy. We've had them come back now and say, I've seen patients move more in the last handful of months where I've been leveraging these principles and strategies than I have in years of traditional therapy. The specialized knowledge just isn't out there. And that's part of I think the real benefit of what it is that we get to do, because we have this specialized knowledge and we can help people with this stuff.
Yeah. So take me there. Obviously, you've done that in a ton of different organizations. You've done it for virtually every industry you could think of, virtually every function you could think of. Any scenario that could possibly come up, it seems like you've kind of been there, done that. What have been some of the ones that have stuck out to you in terms of work with some of these different groups, different companies, different people?
Probably. So I took over the training side of Too Logical from Joe, I think in 96 or 97, I think. And I worked with a handful of regional organizations and things like that in those early phases, kind of just getting my feet under me. I'm thinking of like a regional bank that we worked with that had, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 branches at the time. And I think they were the first client that I had sole responsibility for, and in working with their CEO, their executive team, and eventually I think we trained at the time they had about 400 employees. I think we trained probably 360 of them, and then ongoing coached them and watched them expand from the 5 or 6 branches to, with over, I think 20 or 25 of what we grew the bank more than they ever thought that they were going to be able to grow. So that was kind of my first experience in it. But even then, I think I was still, it's hard when you first start out doing this. We're human beings and we have our own insecurities and all of that kind of stuff. And so it's hard to wrap your head around the fact that you would have had any impact on that kind of stuff, because you just see yourself as, I'm just some friggin' nitwit, and what the hell do I know kind of thing, So you don't really, at least in those early phases for me, I didn't have a full, I think, appreciation of the specialized knowledge and the difference that it could make. I was just so naive about the fact that I could be any kind of a conduit of any of that kind of stuff, I think. And then I remember going from there to a technology company that was competing with HP. They were competing with Xerox, much, much bigger organizations than they were. And so decidedly kind of second, third tier. Great technology, but their mindset was second, third tier. Like, we can't beat these guys and all this kind of stuff. And so they hired us to come in and work with their sales organization. And so we were able to, shift their business model. We took them to a more direct sales model versus just selling purely through value-added resellers. And it was a crazy thing to watch because they went in literally the span of a year from being this kind of second, third tier player in their market to being in a number 1 position with their highest gross margin products. I think they grew sales it was over 400% in that year, to the extent where literally they were chartering jumbo jets to fly product in from Japan because they were selling so much domestically beyond what they had forecast. So that was kind of my first taste of it. I was like, holy crap, this is serious, I just watched it all kind of gel in that organization. And I saw the difference it made in individuals. I saw their lives change because they were doing so much better financially. So that was kind of that was sort of my first big introduction to it all. And then I was like, wow, this is like it freaking incredible. I feel like you, in some small way, can make this kind of a difference in organizations is really cool. And, and what's been neat is, so that, God, that was 125 years ago, I suppose, at this point. And so with each sequential client, your confidence just builds and your self-doubts fade away. And then it's like you can communicate at just progressively higher and higher levels with individuals and have a greater impact with them, and thus, greater impact with organizations. And I have to say, it's a very cool thing to do, and it's a cool spot to be in to be able to do it.
Yeah. Well, it also seems to kind of mirror, just from a journey perspective. You talked about being a skeptic just personally at the beginning, that it's hard to really believe that this could work, that this makes a difference, that this is actually real. And then you get to a certain point in some of those conversations and things with Joe where he's predicting things that are happening 3 months out and exactly how people are going to respond. And that starts happening a couple of times. It's this accumulation where you get to the point where like you can't ignore it anymore. And it seems like it was almost a similar type of journey. Even if you had bought in personally at that point, it was similar in that you're going in, you're teaching this material, you're working with these groups, but at the beginning, you're probably still a little bit skeptical of how big of a difference does it make? Does this really work? Is this really consistent? And then you get to a certain point over time where you keep stacking those wins up, where it becomes something that like, okay, I can't really ignore this anymore.
And you realize too that even if you've experienced it firsthand yourself, that's like the first hurdle. And then the second hurdle, I think, is getting to the point where you feel like you possess enough of the specialized knowledge and you're worthy enough as an individual to be able to pass it on to others.
Mm.
And so that's like that next hurdle. And there's levels to being able to impart it to other individuals. So, like in the early phases, I wouldn't say a lot of people resisted, but there were definitely people that resisted because, again, they were battling their own demons and, and those types of things. And what's been interesting is, as I've gotten further in the journey, people don't fight like they used to, and I don't know if that's, I don't really 100% know why that is. I speculate that they just sense that they could fight if they wanted to, but they're not going to win. At this point, Joe said to me years ago, I asked him why everybody bought from him. And he said, it's because I never sell alone. I always sell with my army. And I was like, your army? What are you talking about? He lists off like half a dozen people that he's had a significant impact on their life. I suppose at this point, I'm one of the people in his army. You are too, I'm sure,
Yeah.
And as time goes on, you build your army, and you have your success stories, and all of that just makes you more and more bulletproof. And I think people probably sense that, and thus they fight less because they know that they're not going to win.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's definitely that. I think even just broadly, probably from where the world is now to, where you all started, 34 years ago, I think the collective awareness around some of these principles is generally higher. I think more people get it now than probably did 30 years ago.
The research has moved in the early 90s. The hardest challenge that we faced in selling it was, convincing people that you could influence people's thoughts and beliefs and it would matter. But it sounded like black magic and hooey-fooey, touchy-feely, and we got all kinds of pushback on that kind of stuff. As time has gone on, what's happened is more and more research has come out that substantiates what basically we intuitively knew in the early 90s, but didn't have the neuroscience or the cognitive psychology to really stand behind it. And as time has gone on, now there's just such a wealth of that. I think it's raised people's awareness enough now that they don't have to be convinced that this makes a difference in individuals. They see it in their own lives. They see it in the people around them. They see it in the folks who fight the most, and they see it in the people who are the most open-minded and agile. So they put up a lot less resistance today than they ever did in the past.
Yeah. I mean, I think the awareness is higher. Probably the biggest hurdle now is not even necessarily the importance of it like it was, in the 90s. Like, well, what does that really matter? The resistance now maybe is a little bit more on, well, can you actually do that?
Right.
And like we said, everybody starts as a skeptic that, can you really do that?
Because they've never seen it or experienced it, and that's the
Right.
biggest thing that people see coming out of the classes. Part of what I love about, the leading motivational intelligence class is I understand everybody's coming in as a skeptic. And I know we've learned over the course of time, I mean, what really are the underpinnings that create that skepticism in individuals, and how do you knock those underpinnings out, so the skepticism begins to fade, and then how do you sequence them in a way that they experience it first, which is really kind of the secret of what that class is about, is that you're teaching them in the guise of leadership and management and all of those kind of things, but really what you're doing is you're helping them to get right themselves here. So they experience it firsthand. They're like, oh, like literally in less than 12 hours, they're sitting there and they're like, looking at things from different perspectives. I had a different conversation with my son last night than I would have had before, a different conversation with my wife last night than I would have had, or with this person on my team or something. So they experience it firsthand. And then you're like, okay, now that you've experienced it, let me show you how we did it. And so you kind of peel back the onion and you show them, so here's what we did with you yesterday. And they're like, holy crap, and they can see, like, you're showing them exactly, and they're like, and then you're giving them the tools to be able to do it with their people as well, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So I want to dive into a couple of examples now. There's one in particular that you've told this story, I think, at seminars before, but I always loved it. And it was work you had done at Bank of America. And you put up this slide at these seminars, which I always loved. And there's like a big heading up top, and I'll put this in the video here, but it's a big heading up top, and it says, "It's in you." And then there's this whole mantra underneath that I'll read real quick, but I wanted to hear the story behind this. But so it's up top, it says, "It's in you." And it says, "I win, and I expect to win every time. My creativity, Bank of America's resources, and my teammates allow no one to beat me. I am relentless and never quit. I am my toughest critic. No one knows my gaps as I do. I crave feedback because it makes me better. I'm not afraid of mistakes, for this is how I learn. The more I learn, the more valuable I am. There are no gaps, only opportunities. I am responsible for what I do. I own my success. I will get the job done for my client, my shareholders, and my team. My team is the best in the business. My team will always do their best. There is no greater feeling than delivering results. There are no excuses. I am never a victim, and I overcome obstacles. I love our clients, what they do for their families, their communities, and this country. I love Treasury, the technology, the new products, the productivity they deliver, and the value they bring. It is my job to share that love with my clients, prospects, and teammates. Finally, no matter the metric, organization, whose responsibility it is, what my manager suggested, or the size of the incentive check, I do the right thing always. Rated H for higher standards. I always love that.
Yeah,
So what's the story behind that?
So when we went into Bank of America, it was probably 2004, 5, somewhere around there. The dot-com bubble had burst. The financial markets were kind of building up to the great financial crisis. And so there was one division within Bank of America, I believe, if memory serves, it was their middle market business banking, I think. So it was basically them working with Fortune 500 companies. And at the time, the market was very saturated. There was a lot of competition. And so the analysts at the time were pretty much of the mindset that it was all about client retention. There really wasn't a lot of growth opportunities and stuff in the market at that point in time. And because that's what the analysts said, then that's what the people believed, and obviously if somebody thinks or believes something, then that will influence their actions accordingly. So what Bank of America did is they hired an executive from outside of the industry to come in and take over this segment of the bank. But he came in and he, did his due diligence and looked at what the analysts said and everything. And he said, I'm of the belief that things are either growing or they're dying. And He said, there's no state of maintenance. There's no state of sameness. Things are growing or dying. And he said, and I didn't come here to die. So, I want to try to figure out how do I grow this? And he was a very aware leader who recognized that the only way you're going to grow it is you got to shift the mindset of the individuals. And he realized that, culture, team culture is really one of the biggest levers of influencing the mindset of organizations. So what you just read, it was a segment of a big movie poster that he had created that was hanging in all of the regional offices for their middle market business banking section. And they would read that statement in their team meetings. I literally watched him handwrite notes to people who are 5, 6 levels below him in the organization when they did something that was consistent with that culture statement. And he had his leaders do the same thing. So they just actively reinforced what that mindset is. And if you look at it, it's really all affirmations. And the really cool part about it was they almost doubled the size of that business in the span of about 18 months, all because you change the thoughts and beliefs, you change the actions, you change the results. And so that was his culture statement that changed the thoughts and beliefs of his team. So yeah, that was a very cool success story. He ultimately got recruited away from Bank of America, and now runs a pretty good sized VC firm, actually. So he's done very well for himself.
Yeah. So how did that all happen sequentially? Why did you end up going into Bank of America? And was the culture statement and everything happen during your work together? Did you put that before, put it together after? What was the storyline there?
So we had come into Bank of America. I don't remember exact time frame, but it was decidedly before that culture statement was put together. And so that was put together while we were working with this whole team. So we were actively working to shift the mindsets of the individuals. And part of what we were talking about was the influence of culture. And so he just picked up the ball and ran with it and developed that culture statement and put it forth to the team from that point forward. So yeah, we were probably working with his team for, I'd say, probably 6 or 7 months before that culture statement came out.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. And double revenue.
Yeah.
Amazing how it works, how it happens. I've heard you tell this story too. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it was over a decade at Konica Minolta. Mm-hmm. And you would see this guy every so often over the 10, 15 years that you're working with in Konica, and he would always greet you the same way. Yeah. What was that story?
So we started working with Konica Minolta. It was actually just shortly after 9/11. And interesting organization. At the time, they were Minolta. They hadn't merged yet with Konica. And they were a distant number 4 player in the market. I mean, literally to the extent where at the time I remember going to their national sales meeting, and their SVP of sales gets up, very articulate guy, was brilliant on stage, gets up on stage and he's doing his introduction. And he said, right now, he goes, we are a distant number 4 in the marketplace. And the reality is the gap between us and number 3 is so great that we'll never be able to span that. So really what we need to do is we need to focus on being the best, the strongest number 4 player in the market that we can be, so that nobody can come up from behind and eclipse us, right? And I literally remember saying in the giant convention center as he's making that speech, and I was moved by just his passion of how he delivered it. But I remember thinking about it after the fact, and like, well, being the best number 4 doesn't really, it doesn't ring in my heart quite, like that, But, at the time, we were pretty newly working with him, and even he didn't realize the ripple effect of what it is the motivational intelligence brings to an organization. And so he couldn't predict that literally 2.5 years later, not only would they not be number 4 anymore, but they would be the number 1 player in the most profitable market sectors in their industry. So a lot can change in short order when you focus on doing the right things. But the story you mentioned, I met, it was probably 2004, I would say. I I was doing a training meeting for them, and there was a gentleman, his name's Tim Disher. Tim lives out in San Diego, wonderful, wonderful man. And I had shared a quote with them. And there's actually a quote that Joe shared with me years before from a gentleman, W. Clement Stone. Stone was the founder of what today is known as Aon Insurance. The quote was, "The rate of the pack is always defined by the pace of the leader." All right? The rate of the pack always defined by the pace of the leader. And for whatever reason, Tim, he grabbed onto that quote, literally to the extent where every time I have seen him since that day, and I generally will, in corporate functions and things like that, he and I will cross paths. And so, I mean, here we are 21 years later, almost 21 years later, right? And the last time I saw Tim was probably a year and a half ago or so. And sure enough, he greeted me the same way. He comes up to me, puts his hand out, and he goes, "The rate of the pack is always defined by the pace of its leader," So literally for 20 years now, it's like, every time I see the guy, it's rate of the pack, but it's such a great quote. And I remember 5 or 6 years ago, Tim, he does that to me, and I just started laughing, I'm like, "Tim," I go, "I'm so glad you remember something from that meeting all those years ago, And I'll never forget, he looks at me, he goes, "Dave," he goes, "it's so much more than that." He said, when I came into that meeting all those years ago, he said, I used to always look at the men and women on my team, and I'd ask myself, what's wrong with these people? It's like, why don't they get it? Why aren't they doing the things that they're supposed to be doing? Why aren't they moving the way they're supposed to be moving? Why aren't they learning the things they're supposed to be learning? What's wrong with them? And he said, I could never figure out the answer to that question. He said, but then you said that quote, that the rate of the pack is always defined by the pace of its leader. And he said, I really thought about that quote. He goes, and the more I reflected on it, the more I realized that all of these years, he said, I've been asking myself the wrong question. It's not about what's wrong with them. Rather, what's wrong with me? What is it I'm saying or not saying that's causing them not to get it? Right? What is it that I'm doing or not doing that's causing them to move the way they're moving? What is it that I'm teaching or not teaching that's causing them not to learn? And he said, I could never figure out the answer to what was wrong with them. He said, but I've always been able to figure out the answer to what was wrong with me. And, and it harkens back to one of the underpinnings of motivational intelligence that we talk about in the classes, which is ultimate responsibility. You can't build anything on a foundation of victim thinking. And anytime somebody finds themselves, pointing their finger out here, and, if they would just, if they would only, what they're doing is they're giving up all of their power. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times where I've had people come back and they're throwing their boss under their boss, or, he or she doesn't get it. They never listen. And, and I keep telling them we're doing this the wrong way, but then they're not hearing me, and so they're doing that business. And I said, have you tried to explain it a different way? Have you tried to explain it in a way that speaks to what matters to them most? And they're, I never really thought about that, And, so anytime you can get somebody who's, point the finger back at themselves, and that's where the answer always lies. I remember years ago, I was at a National Speakers Association convention down in Washington, D.C. And at the time, one of the top motivational speakers in the country, maybe in the world, was a guy, Zig Ziglar. And Zig, he was an older gentleman then. He's probably, at least in his 70s, I would say. And so I had a chance to meet him and get to know him a little bit, at this event. And I'll never forget him saying, he goes, I'll try to do his accent. I won't do it justice, but he had this wonderful Southern accent. Anytime somebody's pointing their finger out here, he goes, they always got to remember they got 3 more fingers that are pointing back at them. He goes, because that's where the answer lies. He goes, no, don't get me wrong. He goes, you got somebody who's trying to grow oranges in Alaska. He goes, man, they got themselves an external problem. He goes, most of the time, because it's much more of an internal problem than an external problem. And I've never forgotten Zig's words because I think they're incredibly empowering. You can't build anything on a foundation of victim thinking. But when somebody accepts ultimate responsibility and they really begin to take ownership of what it is they're choosing to think and what it is that they're choosing to do, it's incredibly empowering. I mean, it really opens up tremendous doors for individuals, because anybody can make excuses, anybody can point fingers, anybody can place blame, anybody can rationalize why something, can't work. But when you put yourself in ultimate responsibility, rather than using your mental horsepower to come up with an excuse, you're using your mental horsepower to come up with a different approach or a different way to how to tackle a challenge.
Yeah. Is that a commonality you've seen in working with, all these different teams, all these different organizations, that is kind of an Achilles heel for them? Is that a challenge you see a lot of times?
It is an Achilles heel in almost every single organization we go into. You don't have to look far to see excuse making, blame, rationalization, or finger pointing. And it is incredible how much resistance that creates in an organization. It's incredible how it causes them to fight change, how difficult it makes to implement business tools. I mean, I can't even count the number of CRM failures I've seen, all because they couldn't get people to embrace the buy-in because they were too busy doing this. It's rampant in organizations. It's rampant in the real world. I mean, turn the TV on, watch the news, and just listen for the victim speak. And you won't have to be listening for too long before you start hearing the woe is me and everything sucks and this and that. And you just can't build anything on that. So when a person lets go of the excuses, I mean, it profoundly shifts their mindset.
I think one of the other concepts that, it makes me think of, I think is something that we see all the time, even just the different ways that people view their job, what they do, what their purpose or their mission is there. A lot of times with the due diligence, you'll interview people that are doing, very well, that are at the top of the playing field, and you'll interview people that are really struggling, and kind of start to pick apart how are the top performers thinking differently than those that are struggling. Has that been another thing that you've noticed, just how they see their purpose, their day-to-day, how they see themselves or their job role?
100%. I mean, anytime you got somebody who's struggling, there's three variables that to one degree or other will be out of whack. And so if you want to get them on a right track, and this is true whether you're talking about an individual or a team or even an organization as a whole, there has to be a clarity of vision and purpose. And so there has to be, it's something that's galvanizing a person's sense of direction, so they've got to have a clarity of where exactly they're going and why that matters for them, right? That's the vision and purpose side of things. What that is that's a spark or a triggering mechanism of motivational intelligence. So, and that's true whether we're talking individuals or teams. So that's the first component. The second one is being properly rooted in the belief of ultimate responsibility. So anytime that you've got an individual or a group of individuals who are not rooted properly in responsibility, you see a whole host of limiting behaviors. So that's where the finger pointing, the blame, the rationalization, the excuses, all of those things just begin to run rampant. And sadly, misery and mediocrity loves company. So, if you've got a handful of these people on a team, they do a wonderful job convincing other people that they can't win as well. So that's the second variable. The third variable all relates back to what people believe about their own ability to learn. We talk about unlimited potential, which is really that everybody has the unlimited ability to learn. They have the unlimited ability to be better at something tomorrow than they are today. That doesn't mean everybody is going to go on to become a virtuoso musician, or they're going to go on to become a gold medalist in the Olympic or something like that. What it means is they can be better at something tomorrow than they are today. That's all it means. And when somebody believes that they can be better at something tomorrow than they are today, it opens their mind. They become more reflective. They will embrace feedback rather than fighting it. They give themselves permission to practice things. When they encounter resistance or adversity, it's not that they're not going to struggle, but they'll stand back up and persist moving forward. So they become infinitely easier to coach, to mentor if you're a leader, and just more open to learning and practicing things. So you weave these three variables together, and that's what really creates a growth mindset in individuals. What's what creates that higher level of motivational intelligence in people. So that's, to a large extent, that's what we've always focused on when we go into organizations, anchoring those three variables the right way.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's amazing the difference that you see it make, particularly in rapidly evolving high stakes situations, just how it affects how people act and react to the decisions that get made when that's in place versus when that's not in place. A lot of times the decisions they make are so different. There's one example, it was the BP oil spill in 2008. Can you tell a story about that?
Yeah. So I'll put a little context around it because they're to kind of fill in the story a bit. So kind of go back in history. I think I remember it was 2009, 2010, somewhere around there. There was a oil rig out in the Gulf of Mexico, and so they had a blowout on this rig, created a huge environmental disaster as a result of that. One of our clients, a company by the name of Baker Hughes, a big player in the energy business. There's really three big players in the energy services side of things. There's Baker Hughes, there's Halliburton, and Schlumberger. Baker Hughes and Halliburton are both American companies. Schlumberger is a French company. So this BP, British Petroleum rig that was out in the Gulf of Mexico, Halliburton was actually doing the job when they had the blowout on it. Prior to this, we've been working with Baker Hughes probably for 4 or 5 years before this. Still work with them to this day. So they're about an 18, 19-year client, I think, at this point in time. But we were working with their Gulf of Mexico team. And when we went in to do due diligence there, they basically had 3 functional roles that they had. So they had a sales role, an engineering role, and an operations role. So the sales went to the major oil companies, British Petroleum, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and basically convinced them to let Baker Hughes come in and drill the oil well and bring the oil out of the ground for them. The engineers would design however they were going to go about doing that, given what the geological formation was, any challenges with the drill site, all of those types of things. And the operations team would actually go out and implement it. Well, as we went into that particular segment, the Gulf of Mexico region of Baker Hughes, what we found out was these 3 teams, the sales, engineer, and operations teams, they basically hated one another. Huge silos that existed between each of those avenues. The salespeople felt that they would kill themselves to sell these deals, and then the engineers, they'd hand it off to engineering to design a solution, and the engineers would design this overly elaborate, expensive solution that they would in turn bring back to the ExxonMobils or the British Petroleums or ConocoPhillips of the world, and they'd be like, "We can't afford that. My God, what are you thinking of?" And so they say, these engineers, they're making it hard for us to sell, right? And then the salespeople would look at the operations folks and they say, and these operation people, they screw up the implementations and they don't tell us about it. And so we go back in for a follow-up sales call thinking we're going to upsell or cross-sell something, and we get blindsided by something that's happening out on a rig that we didn't even know was going on, And it puts us in this firefighting mode, the whole meeting, So the salespeople had issues with operations and engineering. Engineers, meanwhile, were sitting there going like, these damn salespeople, they never invite us on a sales call. They never get all the information we need. They come to us at the 11th hour. They drop this deal on our desk and go, "Here, design something." And then they get pissed off at us when we don't design what they want, right? And then the engineers are looking at the operations folks and going, these operations people, they never build things based upon the way we design them. And then they get mad at us when they don't work the way we said they were going to work, right? Meanwhile, the operations group is saying, well, these damn salespeople, they set these outlandish expectations in the minds of the customers that we can never live to. And then they get mad at us when we don't live to them, And the engineers, they design solutions based upon raw materials that we don't even have access to. And then they get mad at us when we don't build them the way they designed it, So each of these 3 functions, they basically just will button heads with one another. So what we did is, we kind of created a level playing field. We pulled the silos down. We got them to start collaborating and partnering more effectively and put some accountability measures around it so that they were finally working as a cohesive team. So all of this happened right before that rig blew up out there in the Gulf of Mexico. So the rig blows up in the Gulf. The government puts in a moratorium on deep water drilling activity. They had I think it was $450 million of sold business that hadn't been implemented yet, that literally got vaporized on the day that moratorium happened. What Schlumberger and Halliburton did is they basically furloughed all of their workers in the Gulf of Mexico because they said, well, we can't drill in the deep water. So why are we keeping the overhead of having all of these employees here, because we don't know how long this moratorium is going to last for. Interesting, what Baker did, the leaders of those three teams got together and they said, well, we can't drill in the deep water, but there is no moratorium in the shallow water, which is kind of the shelf that goes along the Gulf of Mexico. Traditionally, that had always been dominated by small players, not the big ones, Schlumbergers, Halliburtons, and Bakers don't really play in the shallow water too much at the time. But these three teams got together. They said, how can we design solutions that'll work in the shallow water applications? They reconfigured products. They designed new solutions. They went out, started working with people that owned or leased the seabed in the shallow water. And literally, I think it was 9 months after that moratorium was put in place. I happened to be down in Houston, where Baker is headquartered. And their SVP of sales at the time was addressing the senior leadership team. And he said, I can directly point to $175 million of additional revenue that we have picked up in the shallow water in the Gulf in the last 9 months, simply because these three teams are partnering, collaborating more effectively. And the interesting thing was, ultimately, it was Baker Hughes that sealed that oil well out there in the Gulf and prevented a worse ecological disaster. And when the moratorium came off, because Halliburton and Schlumberger, they had both furloughed all of their Gulf of Mexico employees, they weren't well positioned to come in when the moratorium was taken away. Baker was. So they very quickly assumed a number one market share position in the Gulf of Mexico after the moratorium as well. So not only did they pick up $175 million in wins in the shallow water while the moratorium was in place, but when they reopened the deep water drilling activity, they were positioned to be number one in market share.
Yeah, kind of amazing just from an organizational perspective, having the foundation in place, what differences it makes. Especially something like that you can't necessarily predict, but it seems like we live in a world where more and more you can't seem to predict what's going to happen next week.
Yeah, you and I have talked about it before in the past about how we are in the disruption economy right now. So it's inevitable that you're going to get disrupted in some way, shape, or form in every industry, just given the rapid advancement of technology. And now we're looking at what AI is going to do. And the months and years ahead, that's another huge disruption that'll happen in industries. And so if organizations aren't agile, if they can't adapt quickly, they will cease to exist in the economy as we know it today. So yeah, it's not a nicety anymore for businesses. It's really a necessity if you want to be nimble and agile.
The other thing I wanted to talk about, and maybe Baker's is a good example, just about some of the people that you've met through the years, and we've even had some of them, some of the Baker people, some other people on the podcast that you've interviewed them or we've interviewed them together. So I wanted to get a feel for Baker in particular. Any of those people gonna kind of stick out or come to mind? And have you noticed a correlation in terms of career ascension relative to their kind of buy-in to some of these principles?
If you look at the ranks of their senior leadership team today, almost all of them we've trained at some point in time. Huh. So yeah, if you want to say ascension, that it advances one's career, they're a perfect testimony of that. Most of the folks who are in their senior leadership team were, maybe first or second level managers in the organization when we met them in 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in that range. And now I have to look at some of the folks have come in, they've been transferred in through other organizations and things like that. But the greater percentage of their senior leadership team we've trained early on in their careers. So yeah, I think there's an absolute correlation there.
I mean, one that sticks out, and that's why I was curious, just people that you had met kind of early in the journey, just to see them get to this spot. Paul Madero is one that comes to mind for me. Do you remember meeting Paul?
Paul he's a wonderful, wonderful man. I just have tremendous respect for him. And I remember meeting Paul maybe 2010 or 11, somewhere around there. He was a brand new manager in Oklahoma City, in the operations side of the organization, if memory serves. Had just finished up his MBA, and I think he told the story actually in the podcast that he did about how he just spent, I don't know, however many years getting his MBA, and he's like, I'm so burned out on learning right now and leadership and all of these other things. I can't take another freaking class. But yet he gets recruited to come into one of our classes and realized, like, why didn't they teach me this stuff in grad school? And to his credit, he really embraced it. And literally, I think it was a matter of probably weeks after he went through that class, he had asked us to come out and work with his team in Oklahoma City. I remember being at the hotel and doing it with them. He turns that team around. They turn into a highly producing team. He gets recognized for it. And they literally started to move him around initially the country to different roles where they had problem areas and things, because very quickly they saw, like, here's a guy who can really move the needle in a significant way in teams. So he goes from Oklahoma City to out to West Texas. He brings us out to West Texas to work with his team there. From there, he got promoted, went back to Houston, I think, for a little while. We worked with his team in Houston. He takes some overseas assignments. We worked with his team over in Malaysia. We worked with his team when he got moved to Germany. He keeps rising up and up and up in the organization. He's now a senior vice president in the organization. And so, yeah, we worked with him really almost throughout his entire career and every team he's led.
That's got to be really cool for you, like your perspective, to see how far and how fast he moved through the ranks.
Yeah, he actually just came in. I was teaching a class down in Houston for Baker here a few weeks back, and Paul popped into the class. He had heard through the grapevine that I was there, and pops into the class and was addressing the leaders who were in the group. And he told the story about his journey and how so much of it really started by attending the class. And he said, it changed my life. Because it certainly changed my career, but because it changed who I am as a dad. It changed who I am as a husband. He goes, so it's rippled in me in every way, because I've never been in a class that said anywhere near the level of impact that this one did.
Yeah. Yeah. When it, like everything, we started the conversation saying that, it's easy to be skeptical. And that even you and I probably were skeptical at the beginning. It's easy for everybody to be skeptical. But over time, you start to see how big of an impact it has on you, and then you start to see how big of an impact it can have on other people. There's a couple of other examples. I remember you talking about, and I'll kind of set the stage, and if you need me to fill in some context a little bit, I will, but you've been recognized in airports a couple of times. Yeah. And there was one in particular where a guy came running up to you and told you a story. Do you know what I'm talking about? And could you tell that story? Yeah.
That is one that it almost brings a tear to my eye, just even kind of reflecting back on it. I was out in Los Angeles, and I was just waiting to catch a flight home, and this gentleman comes up to me, and he puts his hand out, and he looked vaguely familiar, but I have a pretty good memory for faces, but names, there's just so many of them over the years. I don't oftentimes remember them unless I've had an extended interaction or something like that. And so he looked vaguely familiar to me, and so I shook his hand, and he said to me, he goes, you may not remember me. He goes, but I was actually in one of your groups a number of years ago. And I'm like, oh, no kidding, and so we're just kind of chatting and whatnot. And he said to me, he goes, when we were all together, he said, you were talking about, management and leadership and people and business and, all this kind of stuff. And he said, but my mind, he goes, it really wasn't so much on the class that week. And I remember I kind of gave him a little bit of a confused look, and he goes, yeah, he goes, at the time, he said, my wife and I, he goes, we were fighting all the time. And he said, it had literally gotten to the point where, we had sat down and taken pen to paper, and we were figuring out, who was going to get what in our divorce. And he said, I sat there that week, he goes, he goes, I couldn't help but realize how how so much of what you were talking about, he goes, it applied to me, just as much at home as a husband as it did at work as a people leader. And he said, I realized in the course of the conversation that there just was a lot of things that I wasn't doing the right way. And he said, so before we had wrapped up for the week, he goes, I had made a commitment to myself that before I went home and I gave up on that marriage, I was gonna do it the right way. I was gonna put into practice the things that we talked about that week. And he looks at me and he goes, Dave, he goes, that was 5 years ago now. And he said, he goes, not only am I still married today, he goes, but today, he goes, I think I have one of the best marriages of anybody I know. And he said, he goes, I know it wasn't really designed to do it. He said, but when I saw you sitting in the airport here, he goes, I just wanted to come over and tell you that, that class that week, he said, it saved my marriage. And it's interesting because I can earnestly say it's probably saved my marriage too. But yeah, it's part of that. I think part of the power of what it is that we do, and I think it's to no small extent why there's the level of buy-in that we get is because it really does. It impacts people in every area of their life. It's not even just their career. It's who they are as a husband. It's who they are as a wife. It's who they are as a partner. It's who they are as a parent. It's who they are as a child to their parents. I mean, it ripples in every single area of our lives.
It is really amazing to see. There's, I was actually a guy in one of the groups I was working with recently that had actually been through, some of our training, I think, probably 15, 20 years ago. And we were going through, some of the Mojo group coaching stuff. And we were talking specifically about like affirmation and visualization. And he's got an incredible story. Little does he know I'm pulling him on the podcast at some point because this guy's story is unbelievable.
There you go.
Former addict, is super successful executive now. And he was talking about how some of the things that he was listening to and the conversations we were having made him reflect on his epitaph, what he wanted on his gravestone. He went through this whole exercise where he developed what he wanted it to be on his gravestone, and how he found that, he's such a driven guy from a career perspective that he had not been as present as he wanted to be with his wife and with his kids. And so this was an exercise he started to use to kind of take it to the day-to-day, to be a little bit more present, to be a loving husband, a devoted father. But it is something that consistently happens, even without us necessarily touching on it or talking about it. It's just what ends up happening is people connect it to all of these other areas of their life, which I think is, to your point, probably why the buy-in is what it is, but it's also what makes the work so cool, so rewarding, because how could you think of anything that would be better?
Well, and you see that a lot actually in very driven individuals, is that they're hyper focused in those areas where they've got their greatest success, or where they have their most ambitious goals, whether they're a great musician or whether they're a very successful business leader or entrepreneur or something along those lines. But they oftentimes are so far out of balance in other areas of their life that they end up sacrificing those other areas of their life, and they don't realize they don't need to. And unfortunately, I think a lot of them, it's not until they've already lost that aspect of their life that they kind of wake up and they say, maybe I didn't quite do this the right way. And it's not that they needed to give up the high level of success that they were enjoying in that other arena of their life, but it's just they needed to hold on to a higher level of focus in those other areas of their life, so they ended up sacrificing them.
Yeah. No, I think that's so true. I think, and honestly, I think it mirrors even a lot of what we've talked about in terms of organizations where, when you prepare, you think about some of these things, you optimize some of your thinking, you optimize the culture of the organization. Like, the Baker example, then when something goes sideways, you're already ahead of it. And I think, same thing can be true in personal lives, that without understanding some of these principles around motivational intelligence, oftentimes you don't realize it until it is too late. For him in particular, I think he has a great relationship with his wife and with his kids, but it's a situation where he looks at it and goes, I want to be better.
Well, and the reality is, and I mean, I know this in my own life, you can have a great relationship now, but if you're not doing the right things, what happens is you're building negative momentum that eventually will catch up. And that's when suddenly you find yourself, you think the marriage is here and the marriage is over here. And you're like, oh, how did I get in this spot? And how do I get out of it? And in some cases, it's so far gone, it's really hard to pull back. And that's when relationships begin to dissolve and stuff. So, Joe said to me years ago, and it took me a long time to recognize the significance of it, was just about the cumulative nature of things. And, so sometimes it's like people, they're accumulating negative momentum and they don't even realize they're doing it.
I mean, we started talking about, what this does is it raises your own self-awareness, even to an extent that you've been trained and mentored this way. To a lesser extent for myself, but you get better and better at over time. There's still times that, we're human, but especially, it's 10, 100,000 times more difficult to have that level of awareness when you haven't been taught these things that, like Paul said, why wasn't I taught this before?
It's probably one of the biggest comments that we hear is we're out working in groups around the world is, why isn't this taught in school? Why are college kids given this? What's interesting, and I actually just saw this. So you and I, before we started recording, I was overseas for most of November of this year. And so when I was over in Asia, what was interesting is there are now schools in Japan and in China where they're beginning to leverage principles of motivational intelligence, literally from the very onset, like 4 or 5 years old. They're starting to work with kids over there, So I was really blown away because it was the first time I've seen that.
Yeah.
I hope that, we've seen some movement in charter schools and, in those things in the United States, but I haven't seen anything to the extent of what I saw as I was interacting with the parents, over in Asia.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. I was actually talking to a senior exec at yesterday, but he was talking about, as a country for America, mental fitness. But he's like, we really need something that has a focus there. And historically it hasn't been, especially if Japan and China are starting to do it. Now it becomes a competitive necessity to start to focus there. So what's the craziest story that you've heard in a group? I have what I think the answer is.
There's so,
there's probably
the reality is, I've got 30 years of accumulated stories, so I'm sure I'm forgetting some even, at this point in time. If you've got one that is top of mind, prompt me, I'll tell it. But
the one
I'm having a hard time thinking of the craziest one.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot. It was I think it was such a crazy story when I heard it that I, figured it was probably the craziest one, but you got a lot in the bank. But it's one that you told actually when we were in Buffalo together, when you were talking about affirmations, and the advanced level of them, not only how they impact us, but how they impact other people or groups of people. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yep. So, one of the things that we talk a lot about when we're working with the groups is, paying attention to how we talk to ourselves. We all have that little voice that we hear in our head, and it's spouting off each of our waking hours, and it influences people to a far greater degree than they realize, to the extent where I'd say anytime somebody's struggling in an arena of their life, if they just pay attention to what that little voice in their head is saying as it relates to that particular arena, they will quickly realize it's either reinforcing the challenge they're battling or it's undermining their ability to be successful. So I remember, actually, it's funny. So this story actually goes back to the very first, at the time the class was called Art of Leadership, but today it's Leading with Motivational Intelligence. So it was the first leadership class that I ever taught for theological. So I'm thinking it's probably, I started, it was 96, 97, I think, when I took over the training. And then we rolled out the leadership class in, it was either 97, 98. So it was, right in that time frame. And so it was the very first group that I ever taught of that. And so we were talking about affirmations in the group. And there was a lady in the group who came up to me at the end of one of the sessions, and she said, she goes, I do volunteer work outside of, what I do for a living. And she said, specifically what I do is I work at a women's shelter where we help women who are coming out of either physically or emotionally abusive relationships to get, back on their feet, to rebuild their lives. And she said, as we were talking about affirmations today, she said, I couldn't help but realize how so many of the women who were coming into the shelter seem to have very common negative affirmations. And she said, so what I was wondering is it that negative self-talk, those negative affirmations that cause these women to get into the abusive relationships, or is it the abusive relationships that cause them to have those negative affirmations? And so I asked her, I said, well, what are those negative affirmations? What are those negative thoughts that resonate in the minds of the women who come into the shelter? And she said, it's incredible how many of them will come in and they just fundamentally believe that they're worthless. They believe that they're incapable of being loved. They think that nobody cares about what they have to say, or they think, as crazy as it sounds, that they were actually fortunate to have been in the abusive relationship because nobody else would want them or nobody else could love them. And I asked her, I said, well, what do you think those abusive partners are saying to those women over and over and over again? She goes, probably that they should sit down and shut up because nobody cares about what they had to say. Probably that they were fortunate that they were in the relationship because nobody else would want them or nobody else would love them. And I said, I'll bet you're right. Because one of the most powerful things to recognize about affirmations is affirmations work equally effectively, whether we use them on ourselves or somebody else uses them on us. In fact, they're such a powerful programming tool that even if somebody chooses not to accept what is being said to them, if it's said enough times over time, with enough repetition, it becomes a dominant thought and they lose the power of choice. This is used in society all over the place. I mean, it's used by governments. It's used, cults use it to influence people's mindsets. I mean, you don't really have to look too far to see examples of it. I watched Joe do it with each of his boys when they were young. And literally, I co-opted the affirmation that he used with his boys, with my kids, because I knew the power of influencing somebody's thoughts in this way. So literally from the day Ben, Michelle, my son, he was born on July 18th, 1898. It was a Saturday, so it was bedroom in the hospital. Everybody was coming in to see the new baby. And I remember it was early evening. Everybody had finally gone home. It was just Michelle, Ben, and I in the hospital room. And Michelle gets up out of the bed and she goes into the bathroom. And so there I am for the very first time, and I'm all alone with my son. So I'm holding him in my arms in that evening, and I looked down into his little blue eyes. And I said, Benjamin, I said, who's the greatest little guy in the world? I said, that's right, son, you are. I said, you know why you're the greatest little guy in the world? I said, you're the greatest little guy in the world because you're daddy's little guy. I said, you're also mommy's little guy. I go, you know what that means, son? I said, that means that you have unlimited potential. He said, inside of you is pure greatness. Mom and dad are here to help you bring it all out. That's our job. I've used that affirmation on that today young man who is 20, will be 27, easily 1,000 times in the course of his lifetime, and I've watched ripple in him. I've watched him fall back on that and use it when he struggled in life as he's been growing up and things like that. And he's really grown into a wonderful, wonderful young man, on the back of that affirmation. I've done the same thing with Catherine, our daughter. And they're both just really, really wonderful, well-adjusted kids today who are making their way well in life. You could be prouder of them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. Affirmations can have such an impact, whether we're using them on ourselves, we're using them on other people, whether they're positive or negative. They're going to wire up how we're going to think, how we're going to see ourselves, how we're going to see the world. And you mentioned cults as a way that those are used in society, along with, governments and advertising and media and all those kinds of things. But there was one woman in particular, I think I remember you saying about that. You remember who I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. I was actually, I was down on Long Island, and I'm working with a group, and I remember her name was Hannah. We had talked about affirmations that day, and she comes up to me at the end of the day, and she said to me, she was, you know what you said about affirmations and cults? And I said, yeah, she goes, you were right. And I asked her, I said, Hannah, why do you say that? She said, she goes, you remember that call down there in Guyana with that guy, Jim Jones, Jonestown? And I'm like, yeah, I remember that, And she said, I was there. I'm like, you were there? She goes, yeah. She goes, I was there 2 months before those people committed mass suicide. She goes, the only reason I wasn't there when they committed suicide was because my parents hired a mercenary to come down into the jungle and kidnap me in the middle of the night and bring me back to the States, kicking and screaming because I didn't want to leave. And I remember I asked her, I said, Hannah, I said, what went on there? And I'll never forget. She said, she goes, I don't know if you noticed or not. She goes, but at one point in time today, when you were talking, she goes, I kind of put my head down into my hands. And she said, when I did that, she goes, I went back there, and she goes, what I remembered was this: every day, in the early morning, in the early afternoon, in the early evening, she goes, we would all gather around in the center of the kind of a central compound, and we'd all hold hands, and she said we would go through a prayer ritual. She said, when I put my head down into my hand, she goes, I replayed the words of that prayer in my head. And she said, for the very first time, she said, I saw how those words were leading us up to that action. So yeah, affirmations, they work equally effectively, whether used for constructive or destructive purposes. And they've been used for both in society time and time again.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I remember hearing that story for the first time, unbelievable. All right. Well, I know we've covered a lot of ground. The thing I wanted to kind of end with, maybe is a good capstone for our conversation today, is I'm curious for you, what have been the biggest light bulbs or the biggest aha moments, either for you personally or with other people?
I think that and we touched on this earlier in our conversation, but I think that having a unified understanding of motivational intelligence has probably been the most significant thing that is kind of pulled everything together. So we had all these threads, in the past, and now, now we see how they're all interconnected and how it influences whether somebody's moving with a fixed or a growth mindset, what they give themselves permission to do or what they don't give themselves permission to do. I think in the last, probably a little less than decade, that's probably been the biggest kind of aha thing that's happened in that regard. And then for me personally, I think that it was really getting grounded in ultimate responsibility and getting grounded in unlimited potential, those two foundational beliefs that support our motivational intelligence. Because when you finally let go of your excuses, you realize your power and what you can really achieve. That in and of itself is tremendously liberating. And then when you pair that with the belief in unlimited potential, the fact that we can be better at whatever we choose to be better at tomorrow than we are today, we give ourselves permission to go after, all kinds of interests, all kinds of things that we thought were beyond us or that we weren't innately gifted enough to do. And And so it's incredible how it opens up a world of learning for individuals and a world of exploration. Your curiosity just gets sparked by that in different ways. And you give yourself permission to go pathways that you otherwise wouldn't have given yourself permission to ever go down, and it's profoundly changed the way that I've lived my life, the things that we've gone after, the things that we've encouraged the kids to go after. It kind of goes back to, what you said earlier in the conversation when you met Joe for the first time, and he said, don't ever let somebody steal your dream away from you. When you're rooted the right way in those two beliefs, you give yourself permission to dream again, and then you give yourself the strength to pursue those dreams.
Yeah, definitely makes life so much bigger and so much more colorful. All right, Dave, I've taken up a lot of your time, but I appreciate you carving it out. Any other closing thoughts before we wrap up here?
I would just share with individuals that if you're fortunate enough to be listening to this podcast, or you're fortunate enough to get introduced to Too Logical, you're fortunate enough to have access to Mojo, take the time. Give yourself permission to be open-minded. Take the time to study and learn, and you will astonish yourself at what you will realize in terms of your own capabilities, what you will realize in terms of your own ability to let go of whatever baggage you might have inadvertently collected through the course of your lifetime. Very few of us, myself included, are fortunate enough to be brought up unencumbered with any baggage and those types of things. So to be able to set that aside and really look at yourself clearly in the mirror and to give yourself the right permissions, there really isn't a whole lot that can hold you back in life. And I think years ago I heard the saying that there are no unrealistic goals. There's only unrealistic time frames, and you give yourself permission to set those goals and to go after things that maybe you wouldn't give yourself permission to. And Sean, you talked a moment ago about, I think you used the analogy of color, and in so many ways, I think it's like suddenly moving from living your life in black and white to living your life in color. It's that profound of a shift.
I think you and I and every story you told today is proof of that.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it.
Yeah. You're welcome, my friend.
This podcast is brought to you by Too Logical, a global top 20 training firm and the world leader in motivational intelligence development. We partner with leading executives to build the #1 talent pool in their industry. We've worked with over 40% of the Fortune 500 in 97 countries worldwide, and maybe we'll work with you next. To try our world-renowned executive coaching service for free, start a free trial of Mojo at joinmojo.com/trial. That's joinmojo.com/trial. You'll get unlimited access to the Mojo platform, custom onboarding, and 2 live coaching sessions free of charge. So, if you want to unlock even greater leadership presence and executive effectiveness, reclaim more of your time, and really build something special, get started with your free trial today at joinmojo.com/trial. That's joinmojo.com/trial.
And the more I studied it, the more I began to see that was the overwhelming commonality of the most successful people that I ever met.
And just the empowerment of the conversations, how it just really motivates you. You don't come across people that impact you that way.
Because a lot of people could say to me, oh yeah, no, I get it. But yet they really don't get it.
This, if you really lean into it, can be life-changing.
Mojo's is part of our DNA and what we do during team meetings.
And I just looked at Randy like, oh my God.
I feel like that's made a lot of impact in my direct report's life because they're not afraid to talk to me.
But I started to see what this gentleman said in the podcast. And I was like, it was just kind of surreal because it was almost like he foreshadowed what I was going to be up against.
They would come in every week and ask me, Paul, how far would you like to get? That's when I told them 105%. And they laughed and I said, no, 105% is where I'm going to be.
I think that concept is one that everybody can buy into, and saying that I can improve 1% from yesterday.
An unstoppable state of mind that enables you and I to achieve everything that we want out of our professional and our personal life.